Okay, we are live and the gutted sky is gone. So we're still working our way through ways to pay for all the bills that are out there. Most, if not all of whom will probably eventually show up here. Last week we heard about proposals for payroll tax. This week, I asked Joyce to come in and kind of walk us through what other taxes. Well, I think they're usually payroll based, but taxes, fees, what's an employer paying now in total? So I thought we would walk through that.
Good, thank you very much. For the record, I'm Joyce Manchester with the Joint Fiscal Office. And Jill, I would like to share my screen. Here it goes. Oh, I can do that. Yeah, great. Excellent. Switch over. There we go. Switch. All right, thank you. So my plan was to talk about various taxes that employers pay because they have employees. So I'm not going to talk about the corporate income tax. That's sort of something else.
We don't have that many corporations anyway.
I will talk about the taxes that are dependent on having employees. So I'm going to talk about the various taxes that employers pay because they have employees. I'll talk about how the payroll tax works and some considerations, of course, at the end. Okay, so let's walk through some of the taxes. So every pay period, employers have to pay federal income tax on behalf of their employees, state and local income tax, that's withheld also, and federal and state unemployment insurance. And this is kind of interesting. A lot of people don't realize that there's a federal unemployment insurance, but in fact, there is.
Okay, so the first two are deductions from the employee's pay?
Yes.
Okay, so that doesn't come out of the employer, but the second two, that's from the employer only?
Well, we'll see. So Social Security and Medicare get split, half employer, half employee. I guess the unemployment insurance and the workers' comp are paid by the employer only. Yes, but of course, in the economist world, we would say that all that is part of total compensation for an individual who works for that employer. And so if total compensation is partly being siphoned off to pay for taxes, that's not going to the employee, right? But yes. And of course, the employers right now deduct the correct amount of taxes from wages, and they calculate their own share of taxes. They deposit the payments, usually filing returns with government agencies, and they have to do that on time. So all of that is already the responsibility of the employer.
So I should know this, but unemployment insurance that the employers pay, is that a premium that's based on whether or not they have employees that claim against them? So it fluctuates and it varies depending on the employer.
Yes, and we are going to look at that
Oh, sure.
a little bit more. So, but yes, and there's a new issue brief, hot off the presses, that will explain it in even more detail if you wish to go there. Okay, so I'm just giving you the big picture of federal income taxes. And my reason for doing so is that I want to point out that some of these ways of raising revenue are progressive. In other words, people with higher wages pay a larger share of certain taxes. Certainly the federal income tax is progressive. The rates go from 10% up to 37%. And you can see where the tax brackets break there for 2023. So when we get to the payroll tax, you'll see it's a flat rate. It's a flat rate that everyone pays up to a certain amount. So
What's the cap on the flat rate on Social Security?
yes, we're going to see that exactly in just a minute. It's 147,000 something, 200. But we will see that. Okay, and Vermont income tax is also progressive. We have 4 tax brackets, and the rates go from 3.35 up to 8.75 with specific levels of cutoffs there, different tax bracket levels. And of course, that is progressive as well. If you attended the tax, what is it called? Tax 101 or whatever, you know that other states have much higher levels at which their highest tax rate kicks in. So the fact that we kick in with 8.75 at what, 252,000 basically is quite different from Connecticut,
They
New
have
York,
lower
et cetera,
rates,
et
but they
cetera.
start kicking in at $40,000.
Well, and their highest rate doesn't kick in until $1 million or more, so it's quite different. So, but anyway, here we are.
So we're not the most progressive.
Well, we are progressive, but we have a high rate at a relatively low.
I think only California is more progressive than we are, but
That's what I define
the
progressive.
California tax base, I think, is somewhat different than the Vermont tax
Absolutely.
base.
Absolutely, no question about it.
30-something million people that live there.
I mean, the people that live there that make $30 million or more monthly.
Yes, and then we come to unemployment taxes, and we'll start with the federal unemployment tax. So these are called FUTA taxes, and they range from 0.6% to 6% only on the first $7,000 of wages. Okay, so everybody who earns 0 to 7,000 pays well, I should say the employer pays this on behalf of the employee. Once you get to 7,000, the employer is no longer on the hook to pay those taxes. So that's sort of a different setup. And these taxes are used by the federal government to pay for the cost of administering state programs, the federal cost of extended unemployment benefits, so all those times when we had more than 26 weeks, I think is
Yeah.
considered extended, that was all paid for by the feds. It's not a bad
Yeah,
deal.
but we had to borrow from the feds once.
Back in, yes, and you can see that right here.
Very expensive.
Yes, so, and those loans are supported by this federal tax, but the federal tax goes up when a state has an outstanding federal loan. And this was the case for Vermont back in the 2008, 2014 period, when we had to borrow to support our UI trust fund. The trust fund was not as generously supported back in the day. And so when the recession hit, things
We had
plummeted.
raised benefits, but we had not raised the tax because we hadn't had any big draw. And when the Great Recession hit, we had a big draw and we did not have the money to cover it. So that's a cautionary tale.
And because we had borrowed, we were paying a higher FUTA rate, the federal
Yeah.
unemployment rate. I don't think it went all the way up to 6%, but I did see as of 2012, it was at 4.6%. So it got to be noticeable. Okay, now we get to the fun part, which is the state unemployment insurance tax system. The state law determines Vermont UI taxes, and they depend on funding in the UI trust fund. How adequate is the funding in the trust fund?
And
But
we
also-
have that report coming
Yeah,
sometime this week. It
Thursday.
just came out.
Yes. And that'll be interesting to look at, but also those tax rates depend on an employer's unemployment insurance experience over the last 3 years. So if you've had people who got laid off and went on to unemployment insurance, then yes, you pay a higher rate, and we'll see how that works. So here's the way it happens. So the Department of Labor is the agency that administers the program. There are 5 statewide tax schedules, tax rate schedules. And which of those 5 you're in is dependent on how solid is the trust fund. Okay, so there are rules that tell you whether you're in rate schedule 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. The third, the middle one, is meant to provide a sustainable level of funding across the business cycle. So if we have regular sort of normal ups and downs in the business cycle, Schedule 3 should do it. Okay, that's how it was designed. Schedules 1 and 2 have lower rates. And right now we are in Schedule 1. So we're at the lowest tax rate schedule possible. Okay, so that's a good thing. That means that all businesses, regardless of their experience rating, are paying
Seeing
relatively.
that, it it should indicate that the fund is in good
Yes.
shape.
Yes, and
Should.
yeah, and I would say it is in very good shape, having just come out of the recession.
Okay, you have advance notice.
Okay, and so you're in a tax rate schedule, but in every tax rate schedule, there are 21 rate classes for businesses. Okay, and what determines where you are on that list from it actually goes from 0 to 20. Where you are is entirely dependent on what's called experience rating. So how many people have you had on unemployment insurance during the previous 3 years? Now, an asterisk, because 2020 was so bad that you, the legislature, decided to omit 2020 from counting in the experience rating calculation. Okay, so 2020 doesn't count. So right now we're probably looking at what, 19, 21, and 22. Okay. So, and I do have this new issue brief, how unemployment insurance tax rates are determined. The reason for that is that it's complicated. I've tried to explain it verbally lots of times, and there are so many pieces, it really helps to have it laid out.
Partly why I asked about that is that I'm intrigued with the childcare funding mechanism, that a degree of complexity that Senator Ron Hinsdale highlighted in one of our previous discussions, where I would love to see if that were to be funded through an employer tax, that there be, not to make our jobs harder, but some degree of complexity where if an employer currently provides on-site childcare and otherwise they would have not an experience rating, but a childcare friendly rating that might adjust their rates. Is that currently in the bill as proposed, or is that anything that's already been floated to your knowledge?
I haven't heard about that, but
The last I heard, there was no funding source attached. It's coming.
Irene had a distorting effect on the experience rating because there were businesses that were wiped out by the flood and they laid off all their employees. Now, we tried to give those businesses relief and we were able to give them some relief, but we were never able to make them whole. And yes, so something, and it was because it was federal. The Fed said, have the federal standards or laws changed on that?
I don't know if they've changed specifically in that way. I don't know. Damien would be the person to ask about.
Well, the state legislature of Vermont voted to give.
Some reprieve.
Yeah, well, that would be the state unemployment insurance. But we can't change the federal.
Right, and the federal laws to influence what we can do at the state level.
Yeah.
The whole thing is to keep that trust fund solvent so that when people need it, and it is, I mean, yeah, you're only paying on the first $7,000, but you have a severe limit on, are we still at a maximum of, it was $300 when we had to borrow.
What was it?
The payment you can get is low.
Oh, the maximum payment. Yeah, it's 500 something.
I thought it had gone up when I heard during Ivy, because it was around 300 or 2/3 of your salary. So if you're really poor, you're only getting 2/3. If you're fairly well to do and own a mortgage and a car payment, it's nowhere near adequate because you're only paying on that first 7,000. And that's probably something that was set during the Depression, and the feds need to look at. I mean,
Yes, and you passed a bill that would raise that maximum by $60, I believe, last year.
yes, I know economic development did a whole lot, but I think that got done with one-time money. Do you remember?
Let's see, so it's supposed to be in effect until a certain amount gets paid out, is it right?
So it's one-time money.
What did you say, 80?
I don't remember
It was
what
like between 80 and 100.
Yeah, so, but by then, the hope is that the IT system for the Department of Labor will have been upgraded so that Vermont has the ability to say, we want to increase everybody's benefit by $25, I think was the plan.
Yes.
But at the moment, the Department of Labor does not have the ability to do that sort of programming. Okay, just to give you an idea of this, the rate schedules and the tax rate classes. So if you want to focus on the tax rate schedule 1, that's on the left-hand side of each of the columns, you can see that all the businesses are rated from, you know, the worst performing, actually this would be the best performing to the worst performing in terms of their recent UI experience.
What's best and worst? What is that?
Depends on the year and what's been going on. So worst means you've had a lot of people laid off, taking up
So it's just
unemployment insurance,
number of folks laid off versus.
Right. experience rating. And it's the amount of benefits they pull down in unemployment insurance relative to their payroll, relative to the wages they pay out. Yeah,
That gets us out of best and worst.
yeah, right.
So the construction industry that lays off every year pays a lot of money.
They're up in 18, 19,
And
20.
there's other industries like that.
Yes. Yeah, so you can see right now the rates are going from 0.4 to 5.4% of wages. And these are wages up to this year, 13,500. So it's a different base than the federal. Okay.
Okay, and so if I'm in the construction industry and I lay off most of my employees every December and don't hire them back till April, I'm gonna be paying 5.4, and the employer pays this, right? So it's coming out of employer profits,
Correct.
5.4, what is it, 8.4?
So that's under Schedule 5. So if the trust fund were in bad shape,
Okay,
we might be in Schedule 5 and then everybody.
so I am paying a lot.
5.4 just on the first 7,000 like
No.
that? No.
13,500 this year. And that too varies with the state of the trust fund, the economy, blah, 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 by law, and that's set in law. Okay, if we're happy with unemployment insurance, I'll move on to workers' compensation, which is mandatory in the state of Vermont. Statute says every employer must pay workers' compensation. And once again, that depends on your payroll, your experience rating, in other words, your safety record, how many people have you had with accidents and so forth on the job, and the type of work performed. And if you thought we had a lot of different options for tax rates under UI insurance, it's much, much worse under workers' comp. I looked at the tables online and they go on for pages and pages. It depends on your industry, it depends on your experience, it depends on all kinds of things. And the rates go from, I don't know, a very small, like 0.09% up to 27%, I think. And it's just a huge variation. So this is workers' comp.
And it was just, I believe I saw the report from the auditor, the misclassification of employees has been, you've got construction companies who have a lot of janitors. Because if you're out on the roof, and logging has been massively impacted by workers' comp costs. Those are two I know of here, but we did a lot of work on misclassification a number of years ago, but it was one way you got around having to pay these high rates because you classified people as in less risky
Interesting, yeah.
jobs.
Or you classify them as subcontractors.
Yes,
Well,
they are
that's the other
exempt.
one,
That's right.
You don't have to have.
They are exempt. Right.
right?
Do we have any reporting on how much pay has been paid to independent contractors over the years? And do we have concern that this is a persistent issue?
I have not worked on that issue.
I think we could check with the auditor's office, because they just issued a report on the number of people that were purposely misclassifying. Some of them are a little iffy, and people make mistakes, but there are some industries that it seems to happen a lot.
Now, in Vermont, you have the choice of either getting private workers' comp or, that means on the market, or you can buy it through DFR. as a state-run program. And if you have a good safety record, you're probably able to get a lower price for the workers' comp by going to the private market. But if you can't afford the private market, then you're stuck with the state system. So it's DFR that
We're
regulates.
the high risk.
Yes, yes. And so it's DFR that regulates the insurers of the insurance market, and it's Department of Labor that deals with program administration and claims.
And I know we've done a lot of work with logging, but I heard that the newer companies with the more automated machinery are doing a lot better because it just isn't a couple guys with a chainsaw out in the woods. That they were doing a lot better on their ratings. Of course, there's a significant investment
Right.
in equipment to get there.
Joyce, I don't know if you made a related distinction between with UI before I got here and that people can self-insure. That if, that got a lot of people who weren't ready for a major unemployment event. A lot of nonprofits asked us to sort of make them whole, but.
Right, I did not mention that, so thank you. Yeah, very true.
And a lot of people that had my phone number called when COVID hit. And they were self-employed people and had not been paying into the insurance, employment insurance. And suddenly they had no fallback. Yeah. There is a cost. I mean, it costs you money to pay in. But if you aren't taking precautions and setting money aside for those rainy days on a realistic level, it hurts when the bottom falls out, which it occasionally does.
Absolutely.
Nature of insurance.
Right.
You pay money in to be there in the case. If you find a way to pay money in, it ain't gonna be there in case.
That's right. And so this was one time where we just had massive, a lot of self-employed people because we just shut everything down and closed off their customers. Got hit in a way they never thought they would.
Okay, and now we're moving to the star of the show, which is payroll taxes. And the reason that it's the star of the show is that it has been proposed as one of several options to pay for early childhood education. It's also being discussed to pay for the family leave program. So I'm going to give an overview of payroll taxes and talk a little bit about what choices can be made with regard to payroll taxes. So they are generally levied on wages, tips, and salaries. So you'll notice I'm not saying fringe benefits. So generally speaking, payroll taxes are not on total compensation, just on the sort of the straight earnings part, wages, tips, and salaries. And generally speaking, they are collected to support specific programs. So the revenues collected would go toward a specific program in most cases. And the ones that we are familiar with, of course, are the FICA taxes, which support Social Security and Medicare. FICA stands for Federal Insurance Contribution Act. The total that's due for employees is 15.3% of an individual's wages. Half of that is paid by the employee and the other half is paid by the employer. So each side pays 6.2% for Social Security, up to a wage-based limit this year of $160,200, okay? And that maximum gets indexed to the average growth in wages in the US. And of course, the average growth in wages is a lot bigger than the median growth in wages because you have all the high flyers that are pulling the average way up, right? So it's quite entertaining if you're bored some evening to look at how that taxable maximum, as it's called, the Social Security taxable maximum, has increased over the years. It's really quite impressive. So anyway, we're at $160,200. In addition, each side, the employer and the employee, pay 1.45% for Medicare, and that has no limit. So that goes all the way up, top of the wage scale. In recent years, there's also been this add-on for Medicare, so that if you earn over a certain amount, you pay an additional 0.9% for Medicare. And that usually gets reconciled on your tax form, because this depends on your total wages, right? If you have 3 different jobs, on your tax form, you add up all your wages and you see if you're over these limits. So it's 250,000 for married filing jointly, 125,000 married filing separately, 200,000 for everybody else.
One user note, it was a surprise to me, is once you reach Medicare, you continue to pay payroll tax. And the payroll tax is not treated as a premium payment towards your obligation. And you pay that separately, which is a very odd structure, but that's.
Yes, back in my CBO days, that was discussed many, many times. It's also true that people pay Social Security taxes on all their wages, regardless of how old they are. So even if you're past the Social Security claiming age, you still pay Social Security taxes on your wages, and it's most likely that you're not getting additional benefits for the additional taxes. So that's seen as sort of a deterrent to older people working, right? Again, that comes up from time to time, but nothing's been done on it yet.
How are bonuses dealt with?
I believe that bonuses are counted as salaries, right? It's labor income. It's to supplement your labor income. So I would think that's taxed as
The
well.
word bonus kind of applies outside of the,
Well, we can ask somebody in the bonus world
Yeah.
if they get taxed on their bonuses, but I believe so.
I had a bar, I'm gonna give me $50 extra one night.
Ooh, did you declare it? You don't have to answer.
A tip is a bonus. I mean, it's a bonus to your salary that your customer gives you.
That's taxed.
Technically, it
Yeah,
should be
typically,
taxed.
I mean, I can see, we've had some recent examples of, I provide you with housing and it wasn't reported as income.
Uh-huh.
Check on it, but I'd be amazed if we had a loophole that big, if my bonus could be 3 times my salary.
Independent contractors, when they garner wages and then do their taxes at the end, they're responsible for the full 15.3%.
Uh-huh.
Is that the next slide? Keep jumping ahead.
Payroll taxes for the self-employed.
Very nice.
Right, so there's something called SECA, which is the Self-Employed Contributions Act, which taxes net earnings. So of course, a self-employed person sort of decides how net earnings gets defined. But you do have to pay both Social Security and Medicare on your net earnings, and you pay both sides. So you're paying 15.3% up to the Social Security maximum. Well, no, I can't say that. You're paying the Social Security tax up to the maximum. You're paying Medicare on the entire amount. And again, you are responsible for the extra 0.9% if your net earnings go above those limits that we discussed. And then you can deduct half of the self-employment tax. So it's as if you're a business, right? The business gets to deduct their half, you get to deduct half. Okay, so that is the landscape of payroll taxes that we are most familiar with, because they are levied by the federal government on our wages, tips, and salaries.
How per diems taxed?
For legislators, for example.
No, not legislation. Yeah, hire a truck driver by the day.
That's their wage, that's their salaries, that should be taxed. If they're self-employed, they're deciding how much of that is
So
wages and
Profit.
something else, yeah.
They're gonna pay for gas,
Right.
the truck
is
payment.
there any, if you were hired a truck driver, not the truck. So, thank you. I'm trying to understand once again what happens when someone working on an interstate highway is paid on a per diem, and it's billed to a New Hampshire company who hires the person to go on a per diem to go work in Vermont.
So the employer is responsible for paying Social Security, Medicare. That comes out of the paycheck. The employee side and the employer side come out of the paycheck. So if they're employed by temporary service or whatever in New Hampshire, then that employer is responsible for.
So if it's in New Hampshire and they're working in Vermont, New Hampshire, so they don't, that is exempt from Vermont income tax?
If they're reporting their income to Vermont because they earned it in Vermont, then they're paying Vermont income tax.
Even if it's a per diem?
I believe so. Sure. I mean, that's their payment.
The tax commissioner's coming in, you can ask him. But that would be my understanding.
We had an employer tax that was set up to fund early child care education. It could vary, then the complexity would be still eligible in your mind that if an independent contractor, a small business provided their own child care, then they could also in a way qualify for not having to pay that employer tax, similar to the complexity with.
So there are lots of complexities there. Maybe we should keep going, but you're
And
about
that
to
gets to be a benefit to the employees, like the Trump apartment. We need to talk to the tax commissioner about how that would be handled. Because if it is a benefit, yeah, I'm not sure how. That's why I hired an accountant to do my taxes.
Okay, so I'm now going to move into the idea of how could a new payroll tax work in Vermont? And we will get to this. So right now, well, no, I can't say that. In 2021, we have numbers from the tax department saying that total wages were about $16.8 billion. Okay, now these total wages consist of all the reports from W-2s. Okay, so they do not include net income from the self-employed. And the tax department is working on trying to get an estimate of net income from the self-employed, but we've been waiting for a while, and they're still working on it. So it's not an easy thing to get your hands around. Okay. The number of taxpayers is about 400,000, and you say, what? How could it possibly be 400,000? Because I'm looking at employed people in Vermont on the Department of Labor reports, and they show me about 310,000, 320,000 maybe. Okay, these are people who had any earnings at all over a year. Okay, so maybe they worked for summer, or maybe they worked for 6 weeks. But for some reason, they have a W-2 that was submitted to the Department of Taxes. Okay, so that's 400,000 people. Okay, now, in the past, we've had proposals for a payroll tax that would pay for single-payer healthcare or would pay for previous iterations of paid family leave. And in those cases, they have been capped at the Social Security taxable maximum. Okay, so the question is how much of the tax base goes away if you impose that cap? So unfortunately, I have to go back to 2021 because that's the data that I can get out of the tax department. And at that time, the Social Security cap was 142,800. Okay, so if we look at all wages up to 142,800 in Vermont, we're finding that those wages are about 92% of total wages. And I have a note there to say that across the US as a whole, if you cap wages at the Social Security taxable maximum, you get only 83%.
So you capped, so if we capped it at 142.8, 92%, we would be taxing 92% of the wages, or 92% of the wages fall above that.
No.
No,
You are taxing.
okay.
Oh, no, most of them are much
Below that, that's what I thought, I just wanted to make sure.
Right, and the difference there between the 92% and the 83% is
Wealthier.
going right at the California example, right, where they have many more people who have very high wages. Yes. Okay, so that's a common situation that you will encounter, capping wages at the Social Security tax max, as it's called in the business. Okay, we also could cap Vermont wages at some other level. And currently, the age 66 paid family leave bill would cap those wages at twice the Social Security maximum. So that's in 2021 going up to $285,600. And that would cover about 96% of wages. Okay, so you can see the amount of wages that is over that is not very good. Okay, and also in age 66 is a provision that would exempt individuals if they earn no more than $25,000 total for the year. So you would have to add up all their W-2s from different jobs to be sure that they were under 25,000. Therefore, well, we're gonna get to that. Okay, let me not get ahead of myself. Okay, so if you take out all the people who earn less than $25,000, you're left with about 234,000. So you can see a big drop off, which is telling you that there are lots of teenagers working part-time, summers or whatever. There are lots of folks who might be coming to Vermont to work part-time. They have to file a W-2 here, but they're not here year-round. About 166,000 people would be under that $25,000 threshold as of 2021. And if you exempt that 25,000, you would be covering about 91% of total wages. Okay. All right. Challenges of administering a new payroll tax. Okay, so first off, we can be sure that the Department of Taxes would likely be involved in administering a new payroll tax. And they do have a very efficient IT system, very good software set up and so forth. But as I say, one very big challenge would be imposing a new payroll tax on self-employed workers. And you can imagine that the self-employed workers could be required to join the payroll tax system, or you could imagine that if they choose to join a program like paid family leave or maybe like early childhood education, I'm not sure. If they choose to join them, they would have to pay in those payroll taxes, right? They'd have to make a contribution in order to get a benefit. So right now we don't know the size of the self-employed tax base, but we hope to get an estimate sometime soon. That will be a challenge for sure, because that's not currently part of their workload. Okay, now the other challenge that I hinted at previously was that if very low earning individuals are exempt, you have to add together all of their W-2s to be sure that they're exempt, that they're under that limit. And right now, age 66 would offer a refund when an individual files a tax return. So in other words, they're paying into the system all year long, and then they'd have to file a tax form to show that all of their W-2s add up to less than 25,000, at which point they would get a check from the Department of Taxes.
And Senate bill doesn't have that piece of it
You don't have an exemption up to 25,000, right?
for this reason.
Yeah, no, it's really tough.
complicated.
Right, and you have to realize that people earning less than 25,000 are probably liquidity constrained. In other words, they're living paycheck to paycheck. And even withholding an extra, whatever it is, $4, $8 every paycheck could present some hardship.
Or they're extremely part-time, because that isn't a minimum wage.
Right.
Annual salary. It would be sub minimum wage, and you're very likely to earn that if you're just a part-time.
Right. Okay. So a few more considerations regarding a payroll tax. I think maybe you all understand now that it's difficult to achieve progressivity with a payroll tax because it's levied at a flat rate on earnings. And if you cap the earnings, you're making it less progressive rather than more, right? Because you're not taxing the high end at all. If you try to exempt, then it has all those complications that we talked about earlier. How do you make this fair without waiting until the end to give a rebate or whatever? So it's time to impose a progressive system.
Does it have to be a flat rate?
Well,
And
so
when you say
traditionally-
it's not progressive because it has a flat rate, that's what not progressive means.
right, so I've not heard of a payroll tax that is not a flat rate. And I mean, there are complications with a progressive rate, right? You have to know the household's number of exemptions and so forth. I mean, it takes some work. So I imagine maybe you could do the same sort of thing for payroll tax, but we don't see it. We
The
haven't seen it.
employer doesn't necessarily know the entire household income.
Well, this should be on wages only, and it should be on the individuals.
Individuals,
But if you have multiple jobs,
jobs, yeah,
employer might not know that.
that is why they should. Okay,
Right. Secondly, of course, the payroll tax, because it's on wages earned, falls only on employees. It does not fall on retirees, people living on returns from wealth and other non-wage income, and people not in the formal workforce. So it is a worker tax, not necessarily on wages. But there are,
I can wait till the slide is over.
I'm about to switch to the positive side, but
Well, I'm just curious because I got the sense that the Affordable Care Act tried to create a workaround for this where you'd estimate your income and then true it up. And it was very complicated. I mean, it is very complicated. I think it's harmed people in the process. But I just wonder if the way that system was designed was kind of a convoluted way was to get at this issue that you get to estimate, but then they still true up.
yes, and that's absolutely right. And you can imagine that a person with multiple jobs or working part-time or seasonal employment or whatever has a much harder time estimating their annual earnings than a person who has a steady job,
Yeah.
right? So that means that it's more complicated for the people you don't want.
and I think any of us that went through truing up with property tax rebates never wants to do that again. Just
There are timing issues.
and just telling people you owe us doesn't sit well. We sent you a check, but you need to send us back.
That's tough. Okay, but there are some positive aspects to payroll taxes as well. So for example, you don't have to worry about deductions, exemptions, and credits, generally speaking, that narrow the tax base. So if you know what your tax base is and you plan to impose the tax all the way up to a certain level, you can pretty much be sure that will be there, aside from business cycle effects. So the other probably positive thing is that labor doesn't respond much to small changes in take-home wages. Now, somebody out there is going to say, well, for secondary workers, that's not true, right? If you're the second earner in a household in which the first earner earns a lot, then the second worker earns not very much, then a change in their tax burden could make them decide to stay out of the workforce. But generally speaking, labor doesn't respond so much to small changes in take-home wages. The jargon is that there's low elasticity there. So we think that payroll taxes lead to a relatively small amount of economic inefficiency. In other words, people don't stop working because of a payroll tax. And finally, it's pretty difficult to evade payroll taxes because it's taken out by the employer based on the wages paid by the employer. So
Unless you're getting paid under the table.
absolutely, if you're in the
And
informal
rumor
market,
has it that there is a lot of that in Vermont.
Would the other be said of an employer tax that there is a lot of inelasticity and that when you tax the employer, that's going to discourage them from taking on and hiring more people?
at some level, yes. I'm not sure anybody knows what that level is, but yeah, I mean, at some point, the total compensation they have to pay is not equal to the productivity they're getting from that employee.
We're gonna do a cost benefit.
I don't want this to be a stupid question, but 1099s, I mean, if you don't get a W-2, but you do a lot of gig work, et cetera, and you get 1099s,
And you're self-employed.
and okay, so you automatically have to be, you're like considered self-employed if all of your income is
So
1099s.
your employer
Yeah.
is deducting and paying taxes for you. then you get a 1099 probably. And the rules for self-employed and payroll tax are different from the rules for employees and employers, right? But you would still be paying Social Security and Medicare under SECA, right?
Right.
That's why SECA exists. And how a new payroll tax would affect self-employed, we don't know yet.
And just to refresh, so it is opt-in the paid family leave bills. In childcare, what was it?
We don't know.
Oh, okay.
There wasn't enough specificity on
Oh,
the
okay.
revenue side to know. I mean, they threw out, what, 6 options for raising revenue? Like
Yeah,
payroll tax, that
right.
was one.
I didn't know if
Debt
that,
service?
the question's been answered in the bill that has come out. Okay.
There's nothing very specific.
This is where it all falls to us. And almost, realistic, how much can we charge? How much can we afford to pay for? Over the, and it can, well, it'll be an increasing rate because prices are gonna go up,
Wages go up too,
wages are gonna, yeah,
so.
okay.
So one takeaway I had from this, when I'm looking to read your body language to whether or not this is viable or not, is that between these two big asks, between childcare and paid family sick leave, my mind keeps going that if these were to go forward, childcare is optimally better as an employer tax, because I see that as a natural area where we can have a more complex adjustment for taking a consideration for employers that provide on-site childcare and so on. That'd be harder to make those adjustments if it was a payroll tax, where you're pushing it on to each individual employer. Whereas the paid family sick leave, that seems to me to, if it were to move forward, to make more sense on the payroll tax.
So I'm not sure I see the distinction, because you would think if the bill said that an employer who provides equivalent or better early childhood education could be exempt, then the employer would be exempt and the employees would be exempt, I would think. I mean, those people, I mean, the employer
Wouldn't have to do the payroll tax.
would not have to do payroll tax, I would think.
Sort of thought the payroll was just across the board.
Well, now, I mean, the bill could specify whatever, and
With the legislature, we can do whatever we want.
that's right. So if the employees were in fact taking their children elsewhere for early childhood education, then maybe you want the employees to pay their share, but not the employer. Maybe the employer is investing already in early care and education, so they should be exempt, but maybe employees have the choice of where to get their childcare, and so you want them to pay the state
We're
rate.
gonna
I don't
hear
know.
that some employers give childcare credits or bonuses
Uh-huh.
to their employees, and some people's workforce is at an age where they don't need childcare. So we'll hear a lot. There's no way to do it so that only people who are using the system pay for the system. And if you allow people to put off paying into the system till they think they're going to be ready to pay, it's like an insurance pool. You need
A lot of people.
a lot of people paying in to keep the cost at a reasonable level for everyone. And you can't opt in and opt out based on if I think I'm gonna have kids this year. Or my kids are out now, so I'm not gonna pay anymore. This is a social good. It keeps jobs in the state. Everybody pays.
So your question also did trigger another thought for me, which is that if the state decides that they want to subsidize early care and education in some way, then the question is, which of the revenue mechanisms is least bad, right? Because no method for raising revenues is great, right? So you have to consider what your options are. And here we've only been talking about the payroll tax, but of course you would need to consider at some point, what's the sales tax going to do to the economy and to people and to,
Well, there's also the early childhood, the child tax credit.
Child tax
that we
credit,
did
yes.
Last
Yes, and how is that paid for?
And none of these raises enough money to cover the cost, so.
Well, you could.
We've got levers in the cost we can play with, but we've also got different, it's gonna be a mix.
Right. And if you think about taxing business, because business might be a big beneficiary of early care and education, you then need to dive into that hole, who really pays taxes on businesses, right? And businesses are not just out there separated from people, right? I mean, people own businesses, people work at businesses, so the tax incidence does fall to people eventually. It might be a different mix of people in different ways, but it's.
Well, it's your total cost of compensation. So if it's gonna cost me 5% in taxes, that's 5% I may not
Have for
have
compensation.
for wages. I mean, there's, yeah,
Just gonna try to crystallize the point that I've been circling here, and I'll stop talking. I swear.
that's fine.
You said least bad. I always argue for most rational. So I like to look for assessment that rationalizes what you're collecting for to directly fund something else. My mind keeps going to your presentation. It shows that our tax code is complex and there's complexity there. And I want, as one person with my lens on this topic, want to incentivize businesses to have more childcare facilities decentralized where people work, because my experience with my spouse was the most important thing for her to go back to work was to have close childcare so that she could walk to see her infants, newborns, and toddlers. So that's where I am interested in a tax code that rewards or maybe subsidizes or waives fees for employers that are able to provide physical on-site close proximity childcare spaces that my also understanding is that we need more of. But with that, I'll stop.
Yeah, I mean, recent experience is that those employers are closing a lot.
And we don't have a workforce there, so
Yeah.
they're no longer.
So,
Absolutely. And the other thing to consider is that it's not just a business advantage to have the early childhood centers close by and helping your own employees. It's also a societal advantage to have kids who are developing to their potential and growing up to have lower health costs and better earnings and not going to jails and so forth and so on. So you would think that at some point there is a social obligation as well.
I think that's definitely one of the premises that this is all based on. Okay.
Am I at the end? I believe I am.
Yes,
Wow,
wow.
thank you. Wow.
I knew that, that's why I was asking for questions.
Perfect. Okay, committee, our next witnesses are not going to be here till 3. Working around tax commissioner actually, and then we have one witness cancel and one add on. So do we have any more questions for Joyce?
Great presentation, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we may need to get a whiteboard if that's possible. Tell David he can substitute that. But I think to start putting possibilities, pros and cons.
And Mark to the cartoons.
Yeah, marking for
It
cartoons.
was already drooling.
Yeah, but
I can supply the eraser.
if history is a model, these bills are all gonna hit us at crossover, and most of them will have to go to approps. We have 4 or 5 extra days if we work Mondays to deal with them, but it'll be a fast turnaround because they have to go to approps, or we'll get 2.5 days if we're lucky, to get these bills out, and I think we'll all be working on them simultaneously, but I'd like to get as much of a foundation here as we can, so when it comes, we're ready. See? And okay, so we are out until 3. Thank you, Joyce.
Thank you.
I'm still looking for the magic bullet. Aren't we all? So you heard money,
Of these
chairs
cats.
meeting is canceled.
Did you hear that too?
Okay.
These germs.
My email is charged.
Judy, maybe you should-
Okay.
Cheers. Oh, cheers.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,